So
is China concerned about the Uyghurs? And let me explain why I asked that. When Syria was knocked over, when the government of Syria fell, many of the people who helped overthrow Syria was not Syrians, like meaning they came from other parts, extremists, terrorists, came from other parts of other countries in order to basically invade and overthrow that government. Regardless of whether they thought they could do it in the beginning, they overthrew the Syrian government. The Uyghurs that were there were effectively saying, we helped overthrow this government and now we're going back to China, and China's next. And I saw that video and I thought to myself, I heard a speaker, I can't remember the guy, I think he was Chinese, but he was making this argument that, China had to deal with a terrorism issue. And the terrorism issue was just so happened taking place in that region. And that the moment that they tried to change those people's mind, meaning denazify the terrorists in this case, that the U.S. starts howling that they're somehow doing something to the Uyghurs, that they're committing some kind of genocide to the Uyghurs. Now, nobody has proven this at all. And this has just been something that they've been outing because people have been throwing the label that the U.S. has been literally backing the genocide in Gaza that everybody with their own eyes can see. Meaning in the China case, you have to take our word for it. In the American case, you could see it with your own eyes. You see what they're doing. You see the depravity that our tax dollars are paying for. And so when I saw the Uyghurs effectively saying, well, we're going back to China after literally overthrowing a government and killing Christians or people who didn't necessarily follow their belief, Alawites, etc., it made me think, I guess that guy was right. What is China thinking about this? I mean, I would imagine they have to be paying attention to the Syria conflict, especially considering some of their citizens are involved in overthrowing the government. Is there any concern that those terrorists are coming back to China? Give me your thoughts on this. This was one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I forgot to ask last time. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. First, there is, quote unquote, no genocide of the Uyghurs in China. Their population has grown, sixfold, and their life expectancy has grown 250%. Those are not the numbers that you get when you have a genocide. The Uyghurs in Xinjiang were exempt from the one-child policy. How many children does Xi Jinping have? He has one child. He was held to the one-child policy like everybody else, like they held all of their leaders. There are no exceptions. And on the other hand, the Uyghurs, being an ethnic minority, were allowed to have 2, 3, sometimes more children, which is why their birth rate is twice the level of the Han majority, and why their population has grown sixfold. So these are just extraordinary mendacities. And they come out of, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is a deep state think tank designed to undermine China. They come out of the words of Adrian Zantz, who was then featured prominently in all the Western media, in particular the BBC. And then he, trickled down into, quote unquote, the left, the left media as well. Amy Goodman gave him, several interviews asking a question about this guy he's like a cotton mather from the 17th century. I mean, he believes, that Jews and gays are going to go to hell and that women should be kept at home and not allowed to work outside. This is the kind of, extraordinary, extremist view that he holds. But Amy Goodman just gives him a free pass, doesn't ask him about any of those things, and then just repeats all of his lies. And then this becomes part of the progressive discourse as well. So, they simply acted as relay stations for State Department propaganda. Nobody has been able to point to a single body in the quote unquote Xinjiang genocide, as opposed to Palestine, which you see is an ongoing atrocity, an ongoing genocide. You can see the bodies every single day, children starving, amputated, killed every single day, babies dying, and at the same time, the US has the audacity to claim that this is not a genocide and that what's happening in Xinjiang, which is a program of development and benefit is some kind of genocide. We're living in an insane world, a crazy upside down world, and anybody who believes these lies, you have to understand, is either shilling as a propagandist, or is completely out of their minds. That said, the Chinese have said for a very, very long time that the US has been trying to radicalize the Uyghurs in Xinjiang to create a theocratic state inside of China. Now, China is a multi-ethnic state. There are 55 ethnic minorities. All of them have equal consideration under Chinese law. They all own land. They all have additional privileges. They all have legislative representation. Even the smallest ethnic minorities. Some of these ethnic minorities, excuse me, are 2,000 or 3,000 people, and still they have legislative representation at the highest, at the People's Congress. And so there's a kind of extraordinary, program of inclusion and representation that China represents. And China does not have a history of repressing its ethnic minorities. Certainly the PRC doesn't do that. How do I know that? Because I am a Korean, and Koreans are an ethnic minority in China. If you go to the Korean parts of China, you'll see that Korean culture is perfectly preserved. People live, good lives. They feel both Chinese and secure in their own cultural traditions, as opposed to anywhere else in the world. You go to Japan as a Korean, Koreans in Japan will not tell you that they are Korean. They will hide their identity, because being Korean in Japan is worse than being Black in the United States. I kid you not. So
really,
I kid you not. Yes. I kid you not. Yeah.
See, I don't know the racial dynamics in these various countries, right? So I'm always fascinated to hear like a minority experience in a different country, like meeting, like you said, a Korean in Japan, or a Black person in Japan, or whatever, religious makeup that the person has in a particular country and how that country regards that person. It's fascinating. I didn't know that it was that way, that extreme.
Let me give you one more example, Jamal. The ethnic minorities are 8% of China's population. They're 8% of China's population, and they possess 45% of China's land, territory, mostly in autonomous regions. Okay, so that is a figure that you will never find in any other country with ethnic minorities. Most countries with ethnic minorities, the ethnic minorities are marginalized and don't have anything. But China has been working on this notion of inclusion and diversity for many millennia. It's a multi-ethnic civilizational state, and it has many flaws. But one of the things that it seems to have figured out is how to create a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state without, one group dominating or one group, erasing the other groups. And the way that it does that is it has built a meritocratic society. For about 2,000 years, China's been meritocratic, which means to say that, you understand that everybody and every group has brilliant people, and you support them to reach the highest levels of political office and political power. And they've done this for thousands of years. So essentially, in that sense, they understand the value of each and every minority. And at the same time, they had a secular government, once again, for thousands of years that did not interfere with religion. So you had Islamists and Buddhists and Taoists, all held under this large umbrella of a secular state that was nominally Confucian. Confucianism is largely a secular religion. So, for example, let's think about the Jewish diaspora. When they first arrived in China, probably around the 7th, 8th century, they settled around the 10th century. They had a meeting with the Chinese emperor. And the Chinese emperor said to the Jews who were starting to settle in China, he said, you have to make a promise to me. You have to make sure that you respect and uphold the traditions of your ancestors. If you do that, you are welcome in China. In other words, if you continue to be Jewish, you have a place in China. Okay. And same thing for Islam. And you see this again and again. This comes out of, a philosophical tradition called Mohism, Mohism. But the Mohists believe that essentially what you want is a kind of universal tolerance, a universal love that, under the sky, all people are family. This is, kind of one of the foundational beliefs in Chinese culture, which is why it was able to create a civilizational state that was multi-ethnic and multi-religious. So all of this doesn't make any sense from a Chinese historical standpoint. But remember, the Chinese said that, have been alleging that the US has been trying to peel off and weaponize small elements of the Muslims in Xinjiang and weaponize them against the Chinese state. And the West has said, oh, no, that's all, BS. The Chinese are just making that up. They're just, quote, using this terror discourse in order to oppress people gratuitously because they're racist Fs, right? And then now you see that, you have these TIP, ETIM militants who have said that we're going to go back to China and create a theocratic ethno-state inside it. We are Salafists, we are Takfiri Salafists. We're going to wipe out not only all the Han Chinese, but any Islamic tradition, which is not Salafist. So this is the threat. And we know that this has been the case because the US has done this over and over again. It did this with Afghan jihadis. Right. It did this against Russia. It did this in, the Islamic fundamentalists were weaponized all over the world, in the Middle East, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, everywhere, against radical nationalist liberation movements, against progressive socialist movements. This has been the bull.
I'm sorry, South America. South America. You're right. It's all over the world. Ukrainians, who did they use? Hardcore right-wingers, Nazis, for all intents and purposes. Right. If you look at South America, they used kill squads in order to go and attack the Sandinista governments because they didn't like the Sandinista governments that they were to the left. It's all over the world. Syria, for God's sake, Libya, for God's sake.
And same thing, Siebel Edwards and Lawrence Wilkerson have pointed out, they've kind of spilled the beans that this was a US plan. The Chinese were not, pulling this out of their rear end. The allegations that the Chinese were making about the Uyghurs creating, terror threats on Chinese soil were real, and that they acknowledged that the US was behind them. So Siebel Edmonds, going back to the early 2000s, and Lawrence Wilkerson said, we are in Afghanistan because we want to be able to use the Uyghurs against China to create trouble for China, as we did for the Soviet Union through Afghanistan, etc. This is a clear and distinct plan. And now the US, after having stonewalled and denied and said that this is a Chinese fantasy, we see that this is actually the case. And the Uyghur fighters have said that we are going to go back to China and sow terror, and we're going to destroy, China and create our own ethno-state. So all of this validates the Chinese position. So then the next question is, are the Chinese worried about this? I would say yes and no. On the one hand, Xinjiang is pretty stable. Okay, so they've created a stable place. US is still trying to destabilize it, because one of the things that China did in order to stabilize Xinjiang was to create massive economic development, vocational training plans, economic development, etc. And by doing this, they were able, to prevent the conditions that result in terrorism. Terrorism, it flourishes under the conditions of poverty and economic deprivation. And so, if everybody is happy and if society is well developed, then nobody has a reason to fall back into these extremist beliefs. By the way, China traditionally does not have a tradition of, Salafist thought. This is, Western Wahhabi Salafist Takfiri thought is very much US, Saudi Arabia created trend or promoted trend. China has an indigenous tradition of Islam, which goes back over 1,000 years, and originally was largely Sufi. There are 4 traditional schools of Sufism that are actually indigenous Chinese. And so Islam is actually an inherent and large part of Chinese culture itself, as much as Buddhism, as much as Taoism is. But anyway, the US wants to weaponize these ETIM radicals against China. Does it pose a direct threat? Probably not so much in the current moment, although the US is continuing to try to reduce Xinjiang's economic development. That's why they're putting out all these, allegations of slave labor. Anything that comes from Xinjiang, cotton or tomatoes or polysilicon, we automatically assume that it is caused by slave labor. And the reason for that is to destroy all the industries in Xinjiang, of which cotton and tomatoes produce and polysilicon are important parts. And the idea is if you destroy the industry, then everybody will be unemployed and they'll resort back to, it'll be another breeding ground for discontent. Right. So this is, extraordinarily cynical because they say they're trying to prevent Uyghurs, but they're actually trying to weaponize them and create more discontent and create suffering in order to weaponize them. But I don't think Xinjiang, for the current moment, is an immediate threat because it's a long distance from Syria to Xinjiang. But what I do anticipate happening will be an escalation on attacks on the Belt and Road projects that go through Central Asia and to Africa and towards Europe. I think terroristic attacks on those will increase, as we have already seen, for example, in Balochistan in Pakistan, where Chinese engineers are routinely killed, Chinese teachers are routinely killed. Anybody working on these Belt and Road projects is just, I think a few months ago, they took a whole bunch of barbers, people cutting hair, and they killed all of them simply because they were working for the project. Why would you kill barbers? Why would you kill day laborers? Ordinary laborers. But this is the kind of terrorism that I anticipate will continue to escalate as we see, as these kind of extremist militants spread out and gain more and more purchase.
Yeah, we have. Man, I mean, I can't argue with what you're saying, right? I mean, the reality of it is we did pay those terrorists. We were supporting those terrorists. We've been paying them and supporting them going all the way back to the George Bush administration, if not before. Colonel Wilkerson, when he was on the show, he pointed out before the George Bush administration, we were backing and supporting those terrorists in that region. And if indeed we were backing the people who invaded and destroyed Syria as we know it, some of those people were Uyghurs, right? So it's not necessarily conjecture. It is just somewhat of a flat fact. KJ, always appreciate you, man. I wanted to get you in before the end of the year because, again, I've been trying to bring the friends of the show to close the year and to open the year. And I really appreciate it, man. You have a fantastic New Year's.